Now, I am really excited to introduce our speakers, but I believe the person that's going to be introducing them to you is one of our co-founders, Catherine Zaleski. So Catherine, would you like to take it away?
I would. So, of course, I've just lost my script as soon as you hand it over to me, but it's the day. So anyway, I thank you so much. I'm back again after more than 24 hours of opening up yet another fantastic summit at PowerToFly. This one focused on tech for social good. And we are ending today with a esteemed panel of people who are at the forefront of this topic. We are going to be led once again by Licy Canto, who is a tireless panel leader, thought leader, overall wonderful human being and advisor. He also has a day job, which is more like a 24-hour job as the managing director for APCO Worldwide in Washington, D.C. And Licy and the team at APCO have put together this fantastic panel on how the tech industry can build a more inclusive future. And we come to work every day at PowerToFly with this mission, much of this mission in mind. And we know that there are so many leaders out there working on the same plane as we are. And yet it's rare that we get to hear what they're doing across multiple sectors on one panel within 1 hour. So I'm going to be taking a lot of notes today. With that said, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Licy. And thank you very much to this esteemed panel for taking the time to share how we can not only create increased representation in tech, but also retention for a truly inclusive future. Licy?
Thank you so much, Catherine, and welcome everyone. And we're back at the kitchen table, as you've heard me talk about before. Two kinds of conversations that my friends in the South talk about. One that happens out on the deck, which is the more casual, and the one that happens around the kitchen table, where the serious and hard thinking and hard provoking questions are asked. That's what we're going to have today for the next 60 minutes. Couldn't ask for a better, more dynamic and extraordinary group of leaders to have that conversation with than Clarence Clayton and Jen Madriaga, two outstanding leaders at Red Hat, and of course, Pamela Passman, a former senior executive at Microsoft, and Bob Winslow, former senior executive at Oracle, but together also part of the APCO family table, as well as the International Advisory Council. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be taking them along the way. And I will be talking with the panelists here on all kinds of things, but we welcome your thoughts as we get underway here today. I want to start, and I want to ask, because I cannot see the panelists. There we are. If the panelists can turn on their cameras. Jenny, thank you. Thank you, Clarence, Bob, and Pamela. Thank you all. All right, now we're all live. We're all in the same room. I hope you guys are having a great day. Let's jump right in to the conversation. Jen, I want to start with you. You've been working on these issues for a long time. You play an enormous role in supporting the work on diversity, equity, inclusion at Red Hat. And as I had been thinking about this panel, I thought about an article in The Economist that was an open letter to the tech industry that concluded a lot of talk, a lot of initiatives, not much action in terms of movement of the needle. That was an article that was posted, if you will, 2 years ago. And here we are today, and almost pretty much you could say the same thing. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and what do you think is important for us to be, as we get into this conversation today? What does an inclusive future at a tech company look like to you? Jenny.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you, Licy, for having me be a part of this panel today. I also want to share a bit of fun trivia. I've actually known Licy since we were both college students at age 17. So I remember Licy with braces. So it's been really, really gratifying to be able to reconnect with Licy on the work and inclusion. So it's really interesting you mentioned that article in The Economist, because that was actually an article that was reshared with me recently by my sister. She's actually an attorney and also working with issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion in her own industry. But one of the things that strikes me today about what's going on, not just within the industry, but also globally, is that people seem to be ready to have conversations that they weren't ready to have before. And the inclusion aspect of technology, well, I don't think I'm telling anything new by saying that there are issues within tech. There are issues within my own company at Red Hat in terms of trying to build a more diverse and equitable and inclusive workforce. And so what I hope an inclusive future looks like is one where representation matters not just by numbers, but also by engaging in very authentic and difficult conversations. We acknowledge the life experiences of the people that are working in industry, and also acknowledging the voices that we have yet to bring in to the industry. And I think that part is also really, really key. One of the priorities for me are issues related to intersectionality, making sure that we amplify each other's voices. I'm the current chair of the Asian Network. I'm so glad to have my colleague, Clarence Clayton, who's the current chair for BUILD, Blacks Unite in Leadership and Diversity. And I'm really, really gratified that people are willing to partner in that way. And those partnerships, I think, are the wave of the future, as well as the difficult conversations. And Licy, I'm so glad that you talked about these difficult kitchen table conversations. I think we're in the process of learning how to have those in tech. And I'm very, very hopeful and optimistic, or I wouldn't be engaged in this work, that we can affect change.
Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for reminding everyone that I once had braces so many years ago. Bob Winslow, you spent a lot of time in this industry, in and out, obviously also working on questions of equity and inclusion in your former life at Oracle and certainly here at APCO. Why is building a more equitable and inclusive future in the tech industry so important to you? And how do we get at what Jenny just talked about, really looking at this question of intersectionality?
Hi, everybody. And Licy, thanks for inviting all of us to join you in this conversation. I was excited about the invite, not because I feel like I'm a responsible executive who's been in tech for 30 years and frankly been privileged to work for a lot of companies that had founders who were very sensitive to a better company is a company that has a diverse conversation. At Oracle, Larry surrounded himself with Safra Katz, CEO, General Counsel, Dorian Daly, Joyce Westerdahl, head of HR, Judy Sim, CMO, all terrific female leaders, and I always felt privileged sitting around that table. But I have to admit I'm a little bit embarrassed. And to your point about the kitchen table conversation, frankly, I think I was a little bit naive until last year. Not just the events, tragic events that inspired so many changes for individuals and companies, but kind of the movement that has been built around that. We all read White Fragility or How to Be an Anti-Racist, or watched the documentary 13, or spent time. A friend of mine, John Ford, who's on Tech Check with CNBC, has the course, which is about Black history. But for me, what happened was in my local community, we had a business that was being discriminated against, shut down in many ways. And it's the first time I got locally involved in my community. And part of the conversation that ultimately led to a change in the police force, a change in how we approach discrimination in our community. And it was the first time I really felt like, okay, we have to start at a local level. Local could be your own local company or the community you live in, but we have to make it personal. And we have to not rely on policy or scorecards. We have to make sure our leadership has taken this initiative personally. And So for me, that's a change that came out of the pandemic that is very positive for me. I think I'm a better individual. I'm a more connected and educated individual, and I'm committed to do what I can to make a change. And I just think I agree with you that Economist article 2 years ago. Have we done enough yet? I'm an optimist, Licy, as you know. I think we are starting to do more, and we're going to see more stories about the change that's happening in tech.
Pamela Passman, are we doing enough, and why for you is it important to be doing more in terms of building an equitable, inclusive future? You spent a lot of years in the industry and continue to do a lot of work in and around the industry on the broader issues of social impact and diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, why are we 2 years later still having this conversation? And what does that future of equity and inclusive tech industry look like for you?
Thank you, Licy, and to my fellow panelists. This is a terrific conversation, and I appreciate being part of it. We want a future where everyone feels a part of it, feels connected, feels like they're contributing to it, and we are receiving the benefit of everybody's contribution. The tech industry is certainly not satisfied where it is. The law of small numbers continues to make this really challenging. And so it is critical that we stay focused on it, and we actually bring new ways of thinking to drive more inclusion in our sector. And I think there's a lot of things that we need to think about, what I would call top down and bottom up. I think our leaders need to lead with grace and really appreciate that they need to approach things in different ways, that the people that we want to bring into our companies are very different, have very different perspectives, come to us with different levels of knowledge and experience, and we need to meet them where they are and help them where they want to go. And also a bottom-up approach. More and more in the tech sector, we're seeing allyship really blossom, and all levels of an organization understand that they have a role to play, that their voice matters, that they have a way to impact and change how their institutions live day to day. So it's something that really is frustrating at its core level. It's something that I know the industry has been focused on, but has not had those really kind of clinic, that like really what is going to change to really change how the industry looks and feels, its tone, its manner, its people.
Clarence, you have been doing this work and in the trenches, so to speak, for quite some time. Tell us a little bit about where your leadership at Red Hat, what is Build, your legacy in getting to the point where you now lead, among other things, this work at Red Hat. And then tell us, for you, what does building an inclusive, equitable future look like?
Thank you so much, Licy, for the opportunity, and Jennifer as well, for bringing me into this wonderful opportunity. So the Build community began about, Build stands for Blacks United in Leadership and Diversity, as Jen said, and our story began about 6 years ago. When I came to Red Hat, I noticed that the Black Red Hatters, if you will, weren't a very connected community. And I questioned why that was. And I think there was a need, a desire to want to connect and just not sure how to do it. And a group of us got together and just started having conversations, just really building community and fellowship with each other first, which was the beginning of something truly special over the last 6 years. Out of this has become a wonderful community that is thriving with energy and creativity and passion and commitment to making Red Hat's culture more diverse and more inclusive. Over the last 12 months, especially, the allyship interest in our work has just exploded. And that's a good problem to have, but also a daunting challenge at times to try to figure out what does that engagement of people and the activation of our allies actually look like, without being overrun with that, because you can be consumed by trying to educate people who want to help. And it's not maybe necessarily your responsibility to educate them, but you want to meet people where they are and try to bring them along on the journey and allow them to be a part of the change that is so very necessary. And I'm thankful that our build community shows up in such a vibrant and colorful way. We own the fact that we represent a small but mighty constituency within Red Hat. We do a lot of work to talk about the causes that are important to us and what we want the company to care about each and every day, and are just trying to shift the narrative and shift the conversation. I say all the time, to your question about what does a diverse and inclusive future in tech look like? It needs to look like the world in which we live. From your board of directors, to your executive leadership team, to your management ranks, to the early talent coming in the door, it all needs to be representative of the world that we live in, and just be a microcosm of the society that the company operates in. And I want to pull on that thread of saying every level. I think Pamela said that every level, everybody plays a role in this success. You can't just focus on the top. You also can't just focus on the bottom. You can, what as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time. That's absolutely the case. We need to be hitting on all cylinders and investing in every level of the company's diversity, so that the next generation of people coming into this organization, in any organization, will be well positioned to make a difference and bring about the change that's needed.
Thank you so much, Clarence. Jenny, I can't help but notice that, of course, you and Clarence have the red hat in your backdrops. For those of us in the audience who may not know as much about Red Hat, tell us a little bit about who Red Hat is, what do you do, and a little bit more about the work you're doing to represent such a large constituency together with Clarence. Tell us a little bit about the Asian network as well. But first, what is Red Hat? And why do you both have a red hat hanging? Is that a company policy?
The Red Hat Fedora is something that's given to every employee when they first come to Red Hat. And Red Hat is most well known for the most used software in the world that most people don't know about, and that's a software called Linux. If you use anything related to the internet, if you do online banking, if you watch a movie on the plane, if your hospital uses an EMR, it is most likely running on top of Linux. Most desktop users have never heard of Linux, but Linux is prevalent in everything and things like banking, the stock exchange, you name it. The Red Hat would like to be known for more than just Linux, and I'll put that little plug in there too. One thing that Red Hat is very well known for is the fact that it is an open source company. We're the most successful open source company in the world. And the tenet of Red Hat is that things are built on community, which I think is a very special thing. And I think Clarence can agree with that. My work is engaging with open source communities within the office of the CTO, within the open source program office. I'm actually embedded within the marketing organization, but my work is on community building. And so the work that I do with the Asian network is actually not too different from the day-to-day that I do at Red Hat, which is working with a variety of open source communities. And what does open source community mean? What are the values associated with being an open source community? Transparency, respect, collaboration. And those are the things that I bring into the work that I do at Asian Network. The Asian Network is a very new organization. We were motivated by the events of the pandemic and the events of last year to come together. There were 5 of us that came together that had an informal conversation. We realized that we needed an official organization in which to build a platform to advocate on behalf of Asian associates within North America and also globally. And it was a really, really hard journey Doing this kind of work is hard because, first of all, you're all volunteers. And so there's a lot of emotional labor that's voluntary. And as Clarence said, sometimes we're tasked with having to educate leadership about issues they may have never ever thought about, to have to include into their repertoire experiences that they may have never personally experienced, and to let people know about the fact, especially because the line between the workplace and home completely disappeared in the past year. The fact that we were bringing the things that happened to us in our personal lives directly into the workplace. So that line completely disappeared last year, and it compelled me and others to do the work with the Asian Network, to educate our colleagues about the fact that their Asian colleagues may be experiencing duress, trauma, stress, due to things that were happening because of the pandemic. And then, of course, were all the conversations that happened around George Floyd. We had it within the marketing organization. And that's when I realized, you know what, we need to have a conversation across the company with all of our different communities. And I want to be able to represent my community and the pandemic effects that were happening related to anti-Asian violence. We launched our community in February of this year, right before the Atlanta shootings. And so the timing in that way was really good for our community because they had a space to gather, to talk about these things that were painful, to talk about the fact that they were worried about their elderly parents. And then Clarence and then his co-chair Corin have been awesome, as have the other chairs of the DEI communities, where we talk about these conversations about the fact that we are now having to bring our full selves to work because that line has completely disappeared just by virtue of working from home, right? And that's the thing that probably is the upside to the pandemic, is that it's catalyzed these conversations that nobody really wanted to have, but we have to have them now. And from what I've heard from colleagues, not just at Red Hat, but from around the world, from other companies, I'm really grateful to get the advice from other employee resource groups, from other tech companies, is that people are ready. They may not always be comfortable, but they're ready. And I think that that's super, super important to note, that there's going to be discomfort around these conversations. There's discomfort about moving forward. But as long as we're united in the fact that we're building a community together, not just between associates or underrepresented and majority associates, that we're actually here to build a better community together. And I'm not trying to be cheesy, but I actually really believe it. I believe it because I can see the story that everyone brings to the table, not just my story, but I can see Clarence's story. I know Bob has his own story. I know Pamela has her own story. And Licy, I know you have your own story too. And that's what I think a lot of this work will entail, a lot of storytelling, not just storytelling, but a lot of listening and leaning in from folks to where all this content is really, really needed them. And sometimes the revelation is very, very painful, right? Like I had no idea any of this was going on. But at least for me personally, I'm here to hold space for people's learning. And I'm holding space for this evolution that's yet to come, where tech will finally be representative of the world that we live in, as Clarence said.
Jenny, you talked about several very important points in your conversation. One of them is having these uncomfortable conversations, which is what we're having at the kitchen table here. I put it another way. This is the walking around with the pebble in your shoe. It's going to feel wildly uncomfortable. For some of us, that pebble is very big. And for others, it's not, but nonetheless, uncomfortable but important conversations to have. And how important, as you and Clarence have touched on, in terms of the importance of education. And Bob, I want to ask you, so much of what we do in this journey for diversity, equity, inclusion, as Dr. Kendi has said, is like we transform ourselves in order to transform society. But part of that's also holding ourselves accountable, which is one of the questions that's come through the panelists. in your time at Oracle and your work right now and advising CEOs and other C-suite executives across corporate America on these issues and many others, whose responsibility is it to educate on what's happening, and what is the question around accountability that Joe asks in the chat here? What does that look like and feel like for leaders? And he puts it mostly white, mostly male in tech. Bob?
Yeah, well, look, I would say that we're communicators, Licy. We work in a business where we help our clients effectively execute their strategy through how well they communicate internally and externally. And what I can tell you is that CEOs, whether it's Bill McDermott at ServiceNow, formerly SAP, or Sasan Goodarzi at Intuit, or Tim Cook at Apple, many of them have diversity reports that they kicked off around this time last year. Right. In talking with all of them and preparing for this panel, all of them have said they're not doing enough. So I said, so what are you going to do about that? And I think one of the things we learned about events over the last 18 months is systemic racism will not just change because we have a strategy in place. We actually have to have new systems and new choices we make. And some of that's starting to happen. There's vendor diversity initiatives where in the Valley, people just won't do business with you if you have don't have a certain makeup on your board or in your leadership team or in the folks that, your staff. There's surprisingly to me, when I was looking at companies that are lauded for their progress, GitLab showed up for the points that Jenny and Clarence were talking about, which is a decision they made that they're a microcosm of the 100,000 customers they deal with around the world, and they want to have an environment that looks like that. We need more than a scorecard, and we need procedures in place that said businesses are not going to operate the way they used to. That has to be defined. It still isn't there yet. It's just starting. The conversation we're having right now, not just today, but in our environment, and the leadership that is sensitive and determined to make this part of their generation, I believe we'll get there. But we can't just have this conversation and go back to work.
Bob, I want to stay for just a second. You played an extraordinary role at Oracle. Tell us a little bit about that. You mentioned Larry. I know we know who you're talking about, but for our audience who doesn't, tell us about your time there, the role you played, so we have a deeper understanding of the legacy that is so rich that you bring to the conversation.
Yeah, certainly. One of the career highlights for sure. And Jenny, to your point, anybody who uses Oracle technology is running a Linux kernel as their operating system. 400,000 customers of Oracle, and they think more about the database, but the operating system. Linux is everywhere. Red Hat is the leader in that field, and so the impact of open source and Linux is just broad and vast. And I always was proud of that because I used to be involved with another open source provider in my career. I will tell you that the interesting thing about it showing up at Oracle, and I'll speak uncomfortably about a few topics, but I think they're important, is that of the 140,000 employees, we did not have enough diversity, and we weren't doing enough about it. And it took lawsuits, discrimination lawsuits, to make it an agenda item that went all the way to the board level. We had Me Too challenges, was right in the heart of the Me Too movement and harassment claims and so forth. These are things that global companies deal with all the time, but when you're in the middle of those, you're challenged with, what's our position on that? And you have to go see the founder and say, let's talk about those issues. My boss, Mark Hurd, ultimately died of a terminal illness, which I had to protect during the time I was there, his personal privacy. The world is complicated.
And you, just to be clear, you are the chief communications officer for Oracle.
Absolutely. And, it was a ongoing conversation of our responsibility on these important topics, our response. But I would say that the one thing about tech that we can't forget is it is determined, whether it likes it or not, to be leaders. Our role, tech is leadership. We are out there with the biggest market caps in the world for a reason. And what comes with that is responsibility to be adult about it. And that was the pleasure that I had in managing on a regular basis for Oracle. It was the ride of a lifetime.
Pamela, tell us a little bit more about your time in your role at Microsoft. Of course, you've continued and gone on to do many, many other extraordinary things, but your time at Microsoft and your perspective on essentially what we've been talking about here is accountability. And what Bob talked about were steps to hold accountable Oracle at that time for the many reasons that Bob talked about. What was that role that you played? You have extraordinary visibility and legacy in the tech industry, given that, and help us understand that, and then your perspective on accountability.
Thank you, Licy. I had a broad role across, as Deputy General Counsel, I had a broad role across a number of our engagements externally with governments, with communities, with academia, with a whole host of key stakeholders, as well as working very closely with Microsoft's business partners, which is a huge part of its business model. And so we recognize that we as Bob said, we had an opportunity and really a necessity to be a leader on a whole host of issues. And I think what was critically important was really understanding the data, if you will, really understanding and being transparent about where we were, but also being ambitious about where we wanted to go and being very clear about the roles and responsibilities. And as you pose the question, accountability. So ensuring that we were transparent, we were ambitious, that managers and leaders' performance was based on their achievements in terms of this space, that all of the hiring practices included a responsibility to have a diverse slate and a diverse, not only a diverse slate, but a diverse interview process. And it really needed to permeate and be embedded across all of our business practices and integral to the business strategy. And it played an important role in compensation decisions. And so it really needs to be, as I said, embedded in the business. And I see this today. I'm on the board of a public company, a SaaS supply chain planning company. And at the board level, it's critical that we ask these questions, that we get certain data on a routine basis, that we have aspirations on where we want to see the company go in the short term, in the medium term. And so that it's something that is part of the muscle that we're building across the organization. And at the bottom line is that our leaders are held accountable for this. Again, through their compensation, promotion, et cetera.
Clarence, I was reading a study recently that showed that combined Black and Latinx employees represent just 3 to 5% of all the employees at the 23 highest grossing tech companies, which I have to take into account. 3 of them are Red Hat, Oracle, and Microsoft, but I don't know, I can't remember. But nonetheless, 3%. The question for you, Clarence, is what are the barriers as we talk about, as Pamela just did, in terms of recruitment and getting talent, diverse, equitable, inclusive talent into tech here? What is that? What is the systemic barrier that is leading to this recent study that shows how few and far between these two constituencies, Black and Latinx, are represented? And more importantly, is when we think about education, how do we create, in your view, and I want to open this up in a moment to the rest of the panel, more opportunity for more diversity in tech and to get into tech and make career advancement more equitable and inclusive? Let's start with the first. What are these barriers that lead to 3 to 5%? And then how do we address that from a career advancement standpoint? Of course, colleges and others are doing a lot of that work, but there's something wrong here. What's your perspective, and how do we get out of it?
We could spend the next 23 minutes on this one. There's so much to unpack. I'll start with one here. A lot of times, word of mouth, employee referrals are the way that a lot of people come into organizations. And guess what I hear and see with my own eyes? People tend to stay in community with people who look like them. So when you already have an organization that has a diversity problem and you say, hey, bring me your friends, refer your people that in your network, you're just going to get more people who probably look like the people already in the organization, and you're not going to be doing very much to address your diversity problem. So
you think that's a particular issue, though, in tech? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that tech in general is less diverse than maybe some other industries. And so therefore, it's more pervasive because of the underlying issues with diversity that already exist in the tech industry, certainly. So that would be one thing that I would say. In terms of, different ways to confront that problem, I'm going to hit the accountability piece and then another, one idea. Certainly want to hear from others as well. Leaders are going to have to commit to doing something different to get a different outcome because it's the right thing to do. Even if that doesn't necessarily win them points with some constituencies within their organization, it's the right thing to do. So I think that having leaders and having companies say, we're going to commit to making these numbers better by X period of time, and putting the goals and the metrics and the tracking and the transparency and the management by objectives around that, pay for performance, make dimensions of diversity and improving diversity, pay for performance as well. Absolutely think that that's got to happen, and that intention and commitment has got to happen at the top. Now, beyond that, investing in recruitment strategies at historically Black colleges and universities. When you think about the early talent strategy, I'm a product of an HBCU. I went to North Carolina A&T State University. And one thing that I will tell you, and I have to give kudos to the IBMs of the world, the DuPonts of the world, 3M. When I was in college, it's been a few years ago now, I won't completely age myself, but those companies were coming to Greensboro, North Carolina with the intention that they're going to leave that campus, bringing back with job offers and bringing back talent into that organization. Now, the companies that we have had the opportunity to work for are wonderful, but sometimes we can believe our own press to the point that we think we don't have to work for it. But if you want those 3 to 5% numbers to move, you're going to have to work for it. And there's nothing wrong with needing to work for it, because it is so very obvious that diversity of thought, diversity of perspectives and life experiences make teams better, make communities better, and make organizations better. So commitment from the top, investing in programs like HBCU recruitment and other groups that are committed to creating more exposure and awareness to underserved communities and giving them an on-ramp into the tech industry through preparedness.
Powerful words, Clarence, powerful words. And I think we all on the panel can completely agree with much of what, if not everything that you said. Jenny, I want to take a question now from the audience, and I want to continue to encourage the audience. We have 20 minutes about left, and so please continue to submit your questions in the chat. This is unique for you in particular, and Clarence, but I want to direct it toward you, is sort of taking a look at your role as leaders of ERGs, and what is this audience member asked, sort of what are those challenges and obstacles that you run into as leaders of ERGs, and how do you overcome them? So let's take, in the interest of time, let's take one or two obstacles, and then what advice do you give to other leaders of ERGs in other tech companies or outside in terms of how do you overcome them?
Yeah, I think the number one question that ERGs probably receive is, why do you exist? Why is there a need for an ERG? Why would you want to, I guess, separate yourself out? And, what I want to say is that, when we go to work, at least, in the past, when I've gone to work before things shifted very dramatically in the past year, I was very focused on just doing my day-to-day job. I was actually traveling about 40% of the year internationally for Red Hat. And I didn't have those kinds of conversations previously because my attention was elsewhere. And it's, like I said, the loss of the delineation between the personal and work environment that really, really catalyzed the conversations that happened for me personally, as well as within the company. And what became very, very clear is that Jenny by herself could not talk about these issues and have them seem relevant to a larger group, because people were identifying as the story of Jenny, an individual story. Maybe it's a one-off, maybe it's an outlier, maybe it actually isn't relevant to the company, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew there were other people who had stories like myself that had the same worries as myself, the same concerns as myself. And that was confirmed when I met with my 4 other co-founders. And then when we did an informal chat room, and just, we weren't even officially launched, we invited people through word of mouth. And the one thing that people said was, we're so glad that we have the space that we can talk about these things. And there are things that maybe our colleagues don't know how to talk about it. They don't have the vocabulary or the experiences for it, right? And part of the challenge of an ERG is demonstrating to leadership, demonstrating to the company why those experiences matter. Why is it relevant to running a business? And I would say, a healthy, happy employee means someone who's productive, who's a very good contributor to the company, if you want to look at it in terms of a commodity issue. But I think, like Clarence said, I think it's the right thing to do. I think part of what we're evolving into as a society, and I want to thank the millennials and Gen Z for this. I'm a Gen Xer. I was taught to just kind of keep my head down and keep working. But the new generations are questioning it. Well, wait a minute. Maybe I want to work for a company that represents my values. And do you actually represent my values? So if you're looking towards the future of any company, you have to realize that your workplace is going to be reliant on these generations that are up and coming. And they're asking those sorts of questions, and they take it very, very, very seriously. And so I think that shift in priorities is actually beneficial to all of us. I definitely believe that it's a tide that's been rising all ships, because it benefits me, like the Gen Xer who kept her head down and just kept working. Now that these questions are being asked, I'm like, you know what? Those are great questions, and I'm going to keep asking them too. And I think, that's part of the difficulty of doing ERG, is that sometimes you're engaging in work that the company has not engaged in before. It's questions that the leadership or managers have not asked themselves, because it's a company that has a majority, and it's not representative of all associates' experiences, right?
How do you, on that point there, what advice do you give the other ERG leaders listening to you right now, maybe sitting in a tech company, and say, okay, I'm facing the same thing. How do you overcome it?
Yeah, I think this is where the intersectionality and coalition building really comes in. And that's why I was really, really interested in working with Build, but I also work with our neurodiversity group, our Pride group, our Native and Indigenous group, our women's leadership community. Those folks are really, really important to that journey too. And I think part is a lot of us are working towards the same thing, which is to make sure that we increase the visibility of folks and their voices in ways that maybe have not been seen before. And part of it too is, like I said, it's the right thing to do, and why is it the right thing to do? Well, work is a big part of our lives. And like I said, we're all taking work home with us, literally. Like we're living, in our households, and and we're working as well as having to manage stuff. I saw earlier in this recording, my 12-year-old son, I think, ran to the bathroom, forgot that I was talking. And that's real life intruding, right? Like I have to manage those things, but what it will do is it'll make us, not just better companies, but I think we'll become better people, and I think it's important for us to become better people for this. And so when I talk to leadership, when I talk to folks where they're like, this is completely new to me, I had no idea that this was even a thing, with experiences related to racism, discrimination, harassment, violence. Sometimes people feel like their physical safety is actually threatened. That includes myself. That's revelatory to my colleagues. In fact, they find it very, very, very frightening that that's something that someone that they know actually deals with that. But the thing is I realize we have to make those things visible now. Otherwise, you're not addressed, like in return to work frameworks, where people are going to be going back to the office and they may be subject to those threats in cities where the attacks may have happened, right? Mm-hmm. Like leadership actually has to think about that type of stuff. And I think it also contributes to better technology. Right. There are very many instances where, including that in the conversation makes our technology better.
And Bob, I want to talk to you about that better technology. Of course, we've seen technology that has the capacity to bring us all together, be a great convener, and then, of course, technology that can separate and divide us. Let's talk about better technology platforms and what you think companies can do to better align products and services to more effectively embrace the DEI aspirations that those companies and society at large is wanting them to.
I want to answer that. I want to double click on something Jenny just said, if I can, real quickly, is that an obstacle that I know we faced at Oracle and I see in advising clients is the fear of showing up as my whole self where I work. So creating this environment of trust is, if there's one thing that we can all do, it's creating that trust and celebrating being able to show up as your whole self. And Licy, you know this in my background from work we've done at APCO, that I had a startling moment in my life in college. I'm Hispanic. You wouldn't know it with the last name Winslow, but I'm Hispanic. And throughout my career, I was always afraid, coming off of that experience, to express the fact I was Hispanic. So we have a moment in time to create this environment of trust and safety that allows people to show up. To your point about technology, interesting fact in that there's so much focus on artificial intelligence, and not just algorithms, but creating text, creating narrative. GPT-3 is one of the languages that gets a lot of the headlines, and guess what it does? It scours the known discourse in the public domain, and so people enter a few lines of code or a few questions, and they can generate an entire blog or an entire book. Guess what it's replicating? The bias and the discrimination that already exists in our narrative. And we're aware of this. And one of the areas, as we look at artificial intelligence and machine learning, is how do we make sure we're not replicating the discrimination that exists in our conversation already. And there's work being done to do that. But that's just one area, because we have a future with artificial intelligence. And this is going to be the dominant thing of our generation at some point, and we have to step up to that from a technology standpoint.
Pamela, there a question that has come in, which is about how do you, as what Bob has just said, essentially, how do you envision prioritizing or reprioritizing, as this audience member is asking, community and DEI in the technology itself, and how to bring forth new information and ideas, as this audience member is asking. What's your thought?
Well, I think the technology sector has realized in the last year and a half that we are a very privileged sector. Most of us are knowledge workers, and we could work from home. And so that this idea of just about access to technology, we're sort of coming back to basics. And that fundamentally, the industry has a responsibility to ensure that everyone has access to technology. And so we're seeing in the United States and other countries, governments more focused on just basic broadband services and making sure that everybody has access to them. And the industry has a huge role to play, not only to ensure access, but that using the technology is meaningful, based on your different skill set levels, based on different kinds of disabilities that you might have, and based on very different perspectives that you bring to the use of technology. So all of this, I think we are, and we will be going through the next few years, hopefully a renaissance on how we think about the use of technology. The economics of the industry have been very strong, even during these really challenging times. And I think there's a great sense of how can we reinvest in our industry so that it is more accessible, more meaningful, more useful to everyone on the planet.
Clarence, Jenny, Pamela talked about the use of technology and making it better, more accessible for everyone. Something that's on all of our minds these days, particularly those who have the privilege of working from home and are waiting to return, if you will, to the workplace. Technology, of course, plays an enormous role in that return to the workplace. How is, and we just have a few minutes here, so if we could be brief, how is Red Hat approaching this question of return to the workplace as it relates to equitable use of technology and inclusive return to the workplace? Clarence?
I'll hit it really briefly. One thing to keep in mind is that before the pandemic, Red Hat was a very remote friendly company. And I think, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think I've heard up to 25 to 30% of our workforce was remote even before the pandemic. And we pivoted beautifully in the midst of very challenging circumstances. Called up our vendors, got us a little bit more bandwidth, and then our infrastructure was ready to go. And because we were already such a remote friendly organization, we quickly adapted to this, fully virtual model, which is, really wonderful to see. Even for the communities, we haven't missed a beat. The build community, in fact, thrived during that time and used that technology to stay connected to each other when we were all supposed to be physically distant. Technology was able to still keep us connected as a community, which was wonderful. Last point I'll really make really quickly. Thankful for the fact that, our leadership has made it clear this return to work strategy will be implemented in a way that is, comfortable to the associate. What it is that works well for you, you'll be enabled to do it. If you want to return to the office, there'll be the means to do that. If you want to be able to continue to work remotely, the opportunity is there. And we've shown that we could still be a successful organization in this remote and virtual world.
Clarence, thank you. And thank you for telling us how Red Hat was already ahead of the curve in terms of remote work and really being a model for how successful you can run a global tech company, of course, with that model. In the few minutes that we have left in our kitchen table conversation, I want to go back to where I started with the article from The Economist. The key takeaway was that not much has happened to move the needle, despite all of the initiatives and actions. The key takeaway from that conversation, that the most important person that could have the single greatest impact on a company in tech influence on DEI is the chief executive officer and the executive. So Bob Winslow and Pam, I want to ask you in particular, in your work with the International Advisory Council here at APCO and throughout your career, what advice would you give today's tech CEO in terms of how to optimally address what we're talking about here today in terms of building a more equitable, inclusive, and diverse tech company, considering you both spent so much time, Bob with Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, and Pam, you with the CEO and senior executives at Microsoft. You have great insight. Starting with you, Bob, what advice would you give? We have just about 2 minutes, so 1 minute each. Thank you.
Sure. And by the way, the great thing about open source and Red Hat is exactly what both of these guys described. They have CEOs that have led companies that are distributed and built communities across, virtual environments. And this is one thing that we believe, the pandemic has created, is that the opportunity to go into neighborhoods that are underprivileged or undersourced will be easier. The one piece of advice, empathy. Have empathy towards your customers and your employees. Create an environment of trust and safety, and being able to have this conversation and know that your career can thrive.
Thank you. Pamela, what advice would you have for today's tech CEO in this respect with DEI, equitable inclusion, and tech industry, both internally and externally?
And I would end where I started, was lead with grace. Really understand, that your employees, that your colleagues come to work with very different perspectives, very different situations, very different life experiences, and to embrace that and to be confident with it. And the second would be to use your voice. The CEO has a very powerful voice, not only internally, but externally, and to use that in those instances where it makes the most sense for your company and where it's most authentic. And I think, you can have a very significant impact on your broader community.
Pamela Passman, Bob Winslow, Jen Madriaga, Clarence Clayton, thank you very much for joining us at the kitchen table here at PowerToFly for what is a powerful conversation that will continue on how to have and embrace a more equitable, inclusive, and diverse tech industry. Thank you so much for all those in the audience who listened and for your questions. And I want to turn it back to Meg and Catherine to continue with the summit. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of our amazing panelists. This was absolutely wonderful. The comment section was blowing up on the website. I just want to say again, echoing what Licy said, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us at this amazing kitchen table conversation.